that has excelled in one particular field, one particular science. That's the first point. And the second point is that as a result, other scholars deem that person as their equal. So they say, it's like, you know when you want to get a PhD, but you can't get a PhD from from a teacher who has a master's. You have to get the PhD from a teacher who also has a PhD. And he will say that you are now one of us. You are part of our equal. Well, it's the same thing with scholars. Other scholars have to recognize that you have reached this level where you are also deemed a scholar. This is why I cringe when people call me a scholar, because I am the last person that is even close to a scholar. I call myself a student of knowledge. I'm a student of Islam, and I'm a student of this knowledge, and that's what I deem myself to be. But the point is here is that you don't want these two parties to look at each other, that any answer that we need in this world, we can find it with each other. Why is this a problem? The problem with this is that when problems and confrontations happen in the marriage, you're not going to look outside of the marriage to solve those problems. You're going to try to fight or bicker with one another. This is obviously, if you try to work things out together and it doesn't work, then what's the next step is? You try to fight it out. And if you fight it out without seeking help and without trusting that others can also help you, that's where problems continue, and that's where it leads to other issues as well. Here is the fourth, if you'd like, guideline in maintaining a happy marriage. There is nothing that I can tell you that is more important than having patience in a marriage. There's nothing I can tell you that's more important than this one. Having patience in a marriage is the key to all happiness in your life. Umar ibn al-Khattab once said that if patience could be a human being, then that human being would be the most beautiful human being on the face of this earth. Patience beautifies you, not only character-wise, but even physically. Physically, you become a beautiful person. Your face becomes more pleasant. Your character becomes pleasant. Your speech becomes pleasant. The way you walk becomes pleasant. How many Muslims do you think know that the Quran actually tells us how we should walk? How we should actually walk when we're on the street, when we're in front of others? Allah says in Surah Al-Furqan that part of the sifat, part of the characteristics of a believer, الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. This is an amazing ayah. Allah describes that the believer, he is the one that when he walks, he doesn't walk out of pride. But at the same time, he doesn't walk like he's the worst or most degraded person. He finds a middle ground. He finds a middle ground. So the Quran even tells you that how you should be walking everywhere you go. Then the Quran tells you how to speak. وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ. If somebody comes to you and tells you something that you don't like or you don't want to hear or it offends you, how do you respond? قَالُوا سَلَامًا. This doesn't mean salamu alaykum. What you say when you say salama, the word salamun alaykum, salam means words of peace. It means words of security. That's why when you say assalamu alaykum to somebody, what you're saying is that you're asking Allah to send down His peace and security upon you. So Allah is as-salam. So as-salam sends down the salam between two persons who give the salam. So this is why it's extremely important that you have patience in a marriage. We mentioned that, and the students here that were in the course, patience is mentioned in the Quran approximately 90 times. 90 times it's mentioned in the Quran. Almost every single time patience is mentioned in the Quran, it's in a different context. Literally, there are probably 90 versions of patience in the Quran. One of the most profound ones is that Allah says in the Quran that when a person is given the reward of entering paradise, then that person will say, Salamun alaykum bima sabartum wa ni'ma uqbad dar. that person is greeted at the gates of Jannah. How? The angels will come and say to them, Salamun alaykum bima sabartum, for what you've been patient with in this world. وَنِعْمَ عُقُبَ الدَّارِ. نِعْمَ عُقُبَ الدَّارِ literally means, what a beautiful ending. So not only does patience get you into paradise, but it stamps and it guarantees that you're going to have a beautiful ending, not only in this world, but also in the hereafter. There is no circumstance that patience is tested more than when you're in a marriage. There's no circumstance that is tested more than when you're in a marriage. Because that is the test where these two personalities, they're not trying to live together, but they're trying to complement one another. That takes a lot of patience. It takes a lot of patience if your spouse doesn't like the food that you make. It takes a lot of patience if the spouse doesn't like the way you dress, and you have to accommodate that. It takes a lot of patience if the spouse says something to you, they mean good, but the way they say it is different. The way they say it is bad. The way they say it is aggressive. Why? Because that's the way they're used to saying it in their own families. It takes a lot of patience. The first mistake that people they make when it comes to losing their patience is, like I mentioned, and this is why I said the first point is don't set expectations, is that if they hear something or if there's a problem in that marriage, and it doesn't work out the way they expected. Why? Because they had a pre-program in their brains. They had something already set in their mind that this is the way it should happen. Then if it doesn't happen that way, and they don't have patience, what happens? That's where problems begin. That's where they can't communicate. That's where they start losing trust with one another. And that's the second, that's the, the fifth point that I want to give you. So you have patience. Patience is the most important, so make sure you highlight that. This is the most important key ingredient for attaining happiness, not only in your entire life, but especially in your marriage. But it leads us to the fifth point, and that is to have trust with one another. To have trust with each other. Trust that each other, whatever decisions you make for the sake of the marriage, inshallah, it's going to be the best decision for each of you. In Arabic, we call trust amana. Amana, actually, the root word for it is amana, which means a believer. So this is why a believer is a person who is trustworthy. So the way to define yourself that you are a devoted Muslim and a devoted believer to Allah is based on how much people trust you and how much you trust them. So it's really important when you apply this to your marriage. Why is this important? When you have trust in a marriage, it's very easy to overlook faults of your partner. It's very easy to do it. Because at the end of the day, all you're going to do is you're going to have husn al-dhan. Husn al-dhan is you're always going to think positive about that person. So if the wife wakes up, like we mentioned yesterday, if she wakes up one day and she says to you, I want a divorce. And you're sitting there and you're like, what in the world just happened? I don't know what to do. But the point is that you trust that maybe she had a bad night, or maybe she thought of something, or maybe there's some other exterior factors that caused her to be this way. And the same thing with the husband. He comes home, he doesn't want to speak to his wife. He just locks himself into a room, or he goes in front of the TV, but he doesn't speak to her. So what does she do? She trusts that perhaps something happened during the day. All of this came because of the amana that she has with him. Number 6 is that for a couple to maintain a happy marriage is that they make sure that they are independent in decision making. In other words, they make decisions on their own. They don't go to mom and dad and say, look, we're thinking of, we want to buy a house, or we want to invest in a business. Mom, what do you think? Dad, what do you think? Sheikh, what do you think? The sheikh, what he really should say is, you tell me what you want to do, and that will be my answer. I get this all the time. I get couples that will come into my office and ask me about how to mold their lives and what they should do. I've even had couples that would come to ask me where I think they should live. Why are you asking me where I think you should live? And he's like, Shaykh, should we stay in this country, non-Muslim, or should we make hijrah? I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty happy where I'm living. How about yourself, right? So really, the decision making has to be independent in the sense that two couples have to lay down a foundation of what you want to achieve. And if you need help, then by all means go and get help. And that leads us to the seventh point. The seventh point to attaining a happy marriage or to maintaining happiness is do not be afraid to ask for help when you need it. Do not be afraid to go outside of the marriage and ask the sheikhs or ask friends or ask family to see if whatever issues you're dealing with, if they can be rectified. A lot of people, they fall under one extreme or the other. They either try to solve every single problem by themselves, or they try to get an answer for every single issue outside. There's no middle ground. I'll tell you that one of the beautiful things about solving problems with yourself is that, generally speaking, if you can do this between your spouse, the result should always be that you become closer as a couple. You should actually become closer to one another as a couple. Eighth point. The eighth point is overlooking the other person's shortcomings and their mistakes. Overlooking them. What do I mean by this? If your husband or your wife has a default or has some part of their life that they just can't seem to strengthen, overlook it. If you can, even ignore it. Because sometimes you may have the most minuscule thing, the smallest part of your life, but that small part of that life, of that marriage, if you focus on it, it's like a mosquito that flies into a beautiful house. You walk into the house and you say, MashaAllah, this is so beautiful. But then you see that mosquito dead on the wall and you're like, ugh, I don't want to live in here anymore. Right? So what you do, you just focus on that small part. You don't want to do that. The classic example of this was the example that we mentioned of Umar ibn Khattab. When Umar ibn Khattab was having an argument with his wife, what does he do? He focuses just on her good sides, on all of the good aspects. And this is actually a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we mention this point here as well, it's important to also note that you also want to enjoy all the good aspects of your spouse, even the physical aspects. Now let me give you an example. One of the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, her name was Salama radiyallahu anha. Salama, one day the Prophet ﷺ came over to the house and she wanted to prepare a place for him to sleep. So she laid out a piece of leather that was on the ground, and you know that leather is impermeable, so it doesn't absorb water. If water was to fall on leather, it just sits there, it pools. So the Prophet ﷺ laid down on this piece of leather. And this is happening in Saudi. And everybody here, we all know that Saudi is a desert in the sense that it's extremely hot. So what happened is when the Prophet ﷺ laid down on this piece of leather, he started to sweat. And his sweat got collected onto this piece of leather. So Salama, she loved him so much that what do you think she went and did? She had a bottle of perfume that she had for herself, and she emptied that bottle. And she went and she got the sweat of the Prophet ﷺ, she put it in the bottle. And as we all know, the Prophet ﷺ's sweat was sweeter than musk. So she used it, and according to one narration, that bottle of perfume, the Prophet ﷺ's sweat ended up being the bottle of perfume that she used for the rest of her life. Why? Because she loved everything about her husband. And he also loved everything about his wife. There's another narration, a really interesting one. Once there was a time when the Prophet ﷺ was sitting in the Prophet's mosque in Medina with his wife Aisha. Aisha radiallahu anha. Now this is it's really beautiful because they're both sitting in there, but they're not sitting in there for any purpose. You know what they're doing? They're just relaxing. That's all they're doing. They're sitting against the wall or against the back then the walls were made out of bamboo sticks. And so they're sitting against this. What are they doing? They're just chatting, they're talking, they're just chilling if you'd like. And an old woman walks into the mosque. An old woman. And this old woman went up to Aisha and she started screaming at her. And started saying, "You're this and you're that," and started arguing with her. Now Aisha, she looks at her husband, and the husband looks at her with a stern face. A very stern and a firm look. Aisha already knew what the Prophet ﷺ, when he was looking at her this way, what he's saying to her is, don't say a word. Just let her finish. Let her do what she wants to do. So Aisha remained quiet. The woman left. This old woman, she left. She went out in the marketplace, and then she returned. After some time, she came back and she went up to Aisha radiyallahu anha. What do you think she did? She did the same thing. She started saying, "You're this and you're that," and she started to argue with him. What did Aisha radiyallahu anha do? She looked at the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ looked at her with a firm look. What does that mean? Don't say anything. This is patience. This is tolerance. So Aisha remained quiet. The old woman leaves. The day continues. The old woman returns a third time. And when she returns a third time, she continues. She does it again. She starts telling Aisha everything in the book. So Aisha, as we mentioned, she was known to lose her cool a lot of times. Okay, she used to lose her cool. And this is not because she was a bad person. It's because she was very young. And as we all know, young people have a tendency to do this. It's natural for them to lose their patience more than the mature adults. So this woman is there for the third time. And the Prophet ﷺ, she looks at the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ looked at her and smiled. This time it was a smile. That indicated to Aisha, now go ahead and give it to her. So the narration concludes itself where she says, فَنَصَرْتُ. What this word means is that Aisha gave it to her, and she gave it to her good. She really let her have it. So the point here is, brothers and sisters, is you see what happens with you see how patience works and how tolerance works, is that there are limits to this. A lot of people think, I need to have patience for the rest of my life in this one situation and that's it. If my husband or my wife, if we're beating each other and we're abusing one another, inshallah I have sabr. This is not the essence of sabr. If you choose to do that, that is a reward between you and Allah Azza wa Jal. But you're not compelled to do it to that extent. Always remember that sabr has a limit. It has a cap for everyone. But if you go beyond that cap, remember that that is going to be a huge reward for you with Allah Azza wa Jal. It's an investment that you give. So I will always say, I won't tell you when you reach your cap, then do whatever you want. I will always tell you and encourage you, be patient as much as you can for the rest of your life in whatever circumstance that you deal with, especially when it comes to your marriage. So we paused at independent decisions. From the things or the guidelines of achieving or maintaining a happy marriage is social time. Social time. What does that mean? It means when you're not involved in any type of worship, it means that you're just relaxing and having a good time. Do things with each other. Go out and see the city. Travel. Go out and have a good time. Go to the parks. Go and have a social life. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ himself did that. There are narrations that him and Aisha radiyallahu anha, they used to, and I mentioned this very briefly in the course, that they used to race with one another. They used to have a garden where he would sit there and he would just have a race with her. Why? This is just to keep that social perspective and that social aspect of their life alive. What does that do for you? When you have a social life, what that does for you is that it relieves the pressure of being in that state of constant worship to Allah. So that you don't always have to think that My day is worthless without doing something like praying